In November 1969, seismometers planted on the lunar surface by Apollo 12 astronauts recorded something so unexpected that one of NASA's senior scientists stood before a press conference and said, on the record, that the moon had behaved as though one had struck a bell, say, in the belfry of a church. The signal did not fade within seconds, as every model predicted. It continued for over an hour. The man who said that was Dr. Maurice Ewing, co-director of the Lamont Doherty Geological Observatory at Columbia University and one of the most respected geophysicists alive. Not a fringe voice, not a theorist working from a basement. A man who had spent his career measuring how planets behave from the inside out, and who had never seen anything like what the moon just did. That single experiment opened a set of questions that NASA has never fully resolved. This video is the story of what the Apollo program actually brought back from the moon, why certain engineers and technicians spent decades trying to push that information into the public record, and why the data still does not fit the story we were told. The first is Ken Johnston, Sr. He was not a peripheral observer or a footnote in the Apollo program's history. Johnston was one of only 4 civilian astronaut consultant pilots in the entire Apollo moon program, men selected specifically to train mission crews to fly the lunar module. He worked alongside Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins personally, running them through simulations inside vacuum chambers at Johnson Space Center in Houston, testing the lunar module's systems under conditions as close to orbital space as Earth could produce. By 1969, Johnston had been placed in charge of the data and photographic records generated by the lunar missions. Every image, every roll of film, every annotated print returned from the surface. That was not a ceremonial post. He was the custodian of the visual archive. The second figure is Karl Wolfe, a U.S. Air Force sergeant who, in 1965, held a top-secret crypto security clearance and worked as a precision photo technician at the Headquarters Tactical Air Command at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. That facility served as a central processing hub for imagery from the Lunar Orbiter program, the unmanned reconnaissance missions NASA launched between 1966 and 1967, specifically to photograph the moon before any astronauts set foot on it. Wolfe's job was to maintain and operate the high-resolution photo equipment that processed those images. He was not a scientist theorizing at a safe distance. He was the man physically handling the prints. The third is Margaret Hamilton, director of the Software Engineering Division at MIT's Instrumentation Laboratory, the woman who led the team that wrote every line of code aboard the Apollo guidance computer. She coined the term software engineering because she believed the discipline needed the credibility of a formal name. She published more than 130 technical papers during her career. In 2016, President Barack Obama awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Whatever her colleagues encountered when that computer behaved in ways no one anticipated, it was Hamilton's software and Hamilton's documentation that recorded exactly what happened. Here is the official version of the Apollo 11 mission, presented precisely as NASA told it. On July 16, 1969, a Saturn V rocket lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida, carrying 3 astronauts toward the moon. On July 20th, the Eagle lunar module separated from the command module and began its descent to the Sea of Tranquility. Armstrong and Aldrin landed at 2017 UTC. They spent approximately 2.5 hours on the surface, collected 21.6 kilograms of rock and soil samples, planted the American flag, deployed scientific instruments including a seismometer and a laser-ranging retroreflector, and returned safely to the command module. On July 24th, all 3 men splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The mission was a complete success. The rocks were analyzed, the data was cataloged, the world celebrated, and within 3 years, with Apollo 17 in December 1972, NASA announced the end of the lunar program, citing budget constraints and shifting national priorities. Clean, complete, finished. Except that in 1971, inside a storage facility at the Lunar Receiving Laboratory at Johnson Space Center, Ken Johnston received an order from his supervisor. He was told to destroy a complete set of 8x10 glossy photographs from the Apollo missions, prints he had personally been responsible for curating and cataloging. Johnston later described those photographs in multiple interviews as containing visual anomalies on the lunar surface, objects and features that had been, in his words, smudged out in the versions released to the public. Way before Photoshop, Johnston said in an interview documented by the New Indian Express, they would paint things out. He refused to destroy his personal copies. He kept them, and he stayed silent about it for more than 3 decades. When Johnston eventually went public, donating photographs and research materials to Roswell's International UFO Museum and Research Center in 2016, he lost his position with the agency. NASA's official response to his allegations was a blanket denial. The agency stated it had no record of any instruction to destroy archival imagery, and that all master files had remained accessible to researchers at the Lunar and Planetary Science Institute throughout the entire period. That is where the record splits. NASA's position is that Johnston was responsible only for duplicative copies of images, not originals, and that any order to clear out storage cabinets during a 1973 downsizing of the Lunar Receiving Laboratory was standard administrative procedure. Johnston's position is that the prints he held showed surface details that did not appear in any publicly accessible version of the same photographs. There is no definitive resolution in the public record. What is not disputed is that Johnston had the access he claimed, that he was let go after going public, and that the question of what those photographs actually contained has never been answered with the original prints. 1,700 kilometers of ocean-separate Langley Air Force Base in Virginia from the story unfolding at NASA in Houston. But in 1965, while Ken Johnston was still years from managing Apollo photography, a 21-year-old airman second class named Karl Wolfe was inside a classified darkroom at Langley, servicing image processing equipment for the Lunar Orbiter program. He had been summoned there to fix a technical problem with the machinery. What happened next, Wolfe recounted in sworn testimony at a National Press Club event in Washington, D.C., in May 2001. A public hearing organized by Dr. Stephen Greer, attended by journalists and former government officials. Wolfe stated that a fellow technician pulled him close and said very quietly, "We have discovered a base on the backside of the moon." Wolfe testified that the airman then showed him a photographic mosaic, assembled from multiple passes of lunar orbiter imagery, displaying on the far side of the lunar surface geometric structures, towers, spherical domes, objects arranged with what Wolfe described as impossible symmetry, their edges sharp against the lunar regolith, their dimensions spanning multiple kilometers. They were structures that were definitely not created by natural means, Wolfe told the press club audience. The structures were created by intelligent beings. He was shaking, he said. He understood immediately why foreign nationals and unidentified civilian personnel had been present in that facility that morning, accompanied by military interpreters, and the technician told him something else. This is the last printout of this section. The rest are being destroyed. Wolfe served out his Air Force career in silence. He testified publicly for the first time 36 years after the incident. In October 2018, at the age of 74, he was struck and killed by a tractor-trailer while riding his bicycle near his home in upstate New York. His death was ruled an accident. His testimony, recorded on video and preserved by the Disclosure Project, remains part of the public record. His critics, and there are serious ones, point out that his descriptions of the structures evolved across multiple tellings, and that no verifiable copy of the mosaic he described has ever surfaced. Those are real challenges. What is not easily explained is why an airman second class with a top-secret crypto clearance, working in a classified facility in 1965, would fabricate a story he would not tell anyone publicly for nearly 4 decades, and why the core details remained consistent across every interview between 2001 and his death. If you have never heard any of this before, subscribe right now. This is exactly the kind of buried history. Primary sources, documented testimony, the questions that never get asked on the evening news, that we cover in depth every single week. Return now to the moon itself, because what the seismometers detected is not a matter of disputed testimony. It is a matter of documented scientific measurement that has been publicly available since 1970, and which has never been fully explained to the satisfaction of the geophysicists who recorded it. On November 20, 1969, after Apollo 12 completed its second successful lunar landing, the crew performed a planned scientific test. They jettisoned the lunar module ascent stage and allowed it to crash back onto the moon at a controlled location approximately 40 miles from the landing site, where the seismometers were waiting. Scientists expected what any reasonable model of a solid rocky body would produce: a brief shudder and a seismic pulse that would dissipate within minutes, the way seismic energy bleeds off through water and magma on Earth. Instead, the moon vibrated for over an hour. Dr. Maurice Ewing, at his Columbia University press conference, stated, "It is as though one had struck a bell, say, in the belfry of a church, and found that the reverberation from it continued for 30 minutes. The actual signal, by NASA's own instruments, lasted more than 60. The Saturn IVB third-stage impact during Apollo 13 would later produce reverberations lasting 3 hours and 20 minutes. Geologists offered a partial explanation. The moon is extraordinarily dry compared to Earth. Without subsurface water or a fluid mantle to absorb seismic energy, vibrations travel through the crust differently. That accounts for some of the extended resonance. What it does not fully account for is the way the signal built, slowly peaking 8 minutes after impact, not at the moment of impact, and the duration of the reverberation relative to the mass of the impactor." Yoshio Nakamura, a seismologist at the University of Texas at Austin who spent decades working directly with the Apollo seismic data, acknowledged on the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 that the lunar interior remains to this day the least understood subsurface environment of any body in the inner solar system that has been directly measured. Now return to the control room at Johnson Space Center, 3 minutes and 27 seconds before the Eagle touched down. That is the moment Margaret Hamilton's software becomes inseparable from the question of what was actually happening aboard Apollo 11 during its final descent. At 20:14:19 UTC, Buzz Aldrin's voice came over the loop with 4 words no one in mission control wanted to hear at that altitude. Program alarm, 12:02. The Apollo guidance computer, 4 kilobytes of memory, hand-woven from copper wire by MIT engineers, smaller in raw processing power than a modern digital wristwatch, had just announced that it was overloaded. The cause was a rendezvous radar switch left in automatic mode during descent, a setting intended only for use during lunar ascent. In that configuration, the radar was flooding the computer with 12,800 interrupts per second, a stream of useless data consuming roughly 15% of the machine's total processing capacity at the exact moment it needed every available cycle to land. Visual note close on the Apollo guidance computer display unit, rows of illuminated digits, a hand reaching for the keyboard, the narrow cockpit window showing the gray lunar surface approaching at speed. At Mission Control, Flight Director Gene Kranz turned to his guidance officer Steve Bales and said one word, "Guido?" Bales turned to his backroom, to a 24-year-old engineer named Jack Garman who had, months earlier at Hamilton's direction, compiled a handwritten reference list of every alarm the AGC might produce and which ones were safe to continue flying through. Garman's answer came back immediately, "We are go." Hamilton's software had done exactly what she designed it to do. Rather than crash, the AGC executed a priority interrupt, stripping away every non-essential process and directing its full capacity toward the landing. It dropped the radar. It reduced display update frequency. It kept its full attention on the surface. Hamilton later described the underlying logic as teaching the computer to recognize which tasks could be abandoned mid-execution and which could not, a design principle so fundamental that it now sits at the base of every operating system running on every device in the world. The landing succeeded with fewer than 30 seconds of fuel remaining. What is discussed far less often is what the same mission revealed through a different kind of silence. As Apollo 11's command module Columbia made its first pass over the far side of the moon, the side permanently turned away from Earth, the side Karl Wolfe claims he saw imagery of 4 years earlier, all contact with mission control was severed. The moon's bulk physically blocks radio transmission during lunar orbit insertion. The crew's private conversation during that 47-minute blackout was not available to the public for decades when the BBC produced its documentary 8 Days to the Moon and Back. In 2019, it incorporated previously restricted cockpit audio recordings of Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins during that radio blackout, recordings that had been deposited at the National Archives in the early 1970s but were not widely digitized or distributed until much later. The recordings feature 3 men speaking in calm, almost reverent tones about what they were seeing on the far side surface. Craters larger than any visible from the near side. Mountain ranges Aldrin described in language Collins quietly suggested he replace with a scientific term. They sound like men encountering something extraordinary for the first time. Not frightened. Genuinely awed. And then as Columbia cleared the moon's limb and radio contact was re-established, they said nothing about the surface at all. They reported burn status and confirmed orbital parameters. Visual note: the curved gray limb of the moon seen from orbit, a thin bright arc against absolute black space, no Earth visible, no stars. What Armstrong and Aldrin may have seen during a 2-minute interruption in the recorded lunar surface transmission is a matter of ongoing dispute. Timothy Good, a British author who spent decades researching government documentation on unidentified aerial phenomena, published accounts in his 1988 book Above Top Secret of alleged VHF radio intercepts made by amateur operators during the Apollo 11 EVA. Intercepts he claimed included Armstrong describing objects parked on the rim of a crater, watching the landing. Those intercepts have never been independently verified. No original recording has been produced. NASA has never addressed them specifically. The claim lives in that uncomfortable space between documented anomaly and unverifiable assertion. The exact details remain unclear and may always remain so. What is verifiable is this: Neil Armstrong, after returning from the moon in 1969, largely withdrew from public life. He gave very few interviews. He declined the speaking circuit that occupied the careers of Aldrin and Collins. In a rare 2005 interview with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, he described himself as a White Sox, pocket protector, nerdy engineer, and deflected every question about the surface experience with precision and brevity. Whether that reflected personal temperament, institutional guidance, or something else entirely, Armstrong took his private account to his grave in August 2012. In May 1969, 2 months before Apollo 11 launched, the crew of Apollo 10, Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan, completed a full dress rehearsal of the lunar landing, descending to within 47,400 feet of the surface before pulling back to the command module. While they were on the far side of the moon, cut off entirely from mission control, Cernan's voice was captured on the internal recorder with a note of unmistakable unease. "You hear that? That whistling sound? Boy, that sure is weird music." A moment later he added, "You know what that was? That's just like something from outer space, really. Who's going to believe it?" Young replied, "Nobody. Shall we tell them about it?" Cernan said, "I don't know. We ought to think about it some." The recording was placed in the public record when mission transcripts were deposited at the National Archives in 1973. It was not digitized and made widely accessible until 2012. A Discovery Channel documentary series brought it to mass attention in February 2016, 47 years after it was captured. The most scientifically accepted explanation, acknowledged by Michael Collins and eventually by Cernan himself, is that the VHF radios in the 2 docked spacecraft were producing an interference pattern at close range. Collins wrote in his memoir that he had been warned about the sound before Apollo 11 departed. "Had I not been warned about it," he wrote, "it would have scared the hell out of me." That warning is what matters here. Someone knew about the sound. Someone told Collins before he left Earth that there was a noise on the far side of the moon that would frighten him if he heard it unprepared. And no one told Stafford, Young, or Cernan, the men who flew there 2 months earlier and heard it first. The Apollo program ended with Apollo 17 in December 1972. 3 additional missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, had been fully planned, funded, and placed on the launch schedule. They were canceled in September 1970, with NASA citing congressional budget pressure and the Nixon administration's decision to redirect resources toward the Space Shuttle program. The Saturn V rockets built for those missions were placed on outdoor display at NASA visitor centers across the country, where they remain today, slowly oxidizing in the weather. The lunar modules constructed for them were repurposed for Skylab backup hardware and ground testing. The scientific case for cancellation has never fully convinced the researchers who designed the experiments those missions would have carried. Dr. Farouk El-Baz, a geologist who served as secretary of the Apollo Landing Site Selection Committee and personally identified the landing zones for multiple missions, stated after the program's end that the scientific return from each successive landing was increasing, not plateauing. The moon was not running out of questions to answer. What was found, and what was not found, in those 382 kilograms of rock and soil brought back across 6 missions include some of the most puzzling material in the history of planetary science. The samples contained no water in any form. They contained isotopes of certain elements in ratios that do